Welcome back to Upgrade to General, a series to help you upgrade your amateur radio license to General class. This episode is Subelement G2, Question Group B, and I'm your host, Ron Call, KE7CR. Let's jump into the first question. Which of the following is true concerning access to frequencies? The idea here is that nobody owns any particular frequency. Frequencies are available kind of on a first come, first serve, or most needed access. Nobody owns the frequency, so the answer is except during emergencies, no amateur station has priority access to any frequency. To be a good operator, whoever's operating on that frequency first, let them have access to that frequency. If you have an emergency and need to interrupt, do so, and people should allow you access to the frequency. So that leads to the next question. What's the first thing you should do if you're communicating with another amateur station and hear a station in distress break in? So the answer is acknowledge the station in distress, respond to them, determine what assistance may be needed. Next question. What is good amateur practice if propagation changes during a contact, creating interference from other stations using the frequency? So if there is interference, multiple stations on the same frequency, the best thing to do is to attempt to resolve the interference problem with other stations in a mutually acceptable manner. It's relatively easy for someone to offer to move frequencies either up or down. Somebody might say, we're finished on the frequency and let the others have it. Whatever is best option, but the answer is attempt to resolve the interference problem with other stations in a mutually acceptable manner. Now, when selecting a CW transmitting frequency, what minimum separation from other stations should be used to minimize interference to stations on adjacent frequencies? Now this comes down to bandwidth. That's what this is all about, is how much bandwidth does it take to operate. The largest bandwidth, usually in HF modes, is FM. It's about 15 kilohertz wide. AM is about 6 kilohertz. Single sideband, which is really just one of the sidebands of AM, so figure about half of that. Typically we think of single sideband as about a 3 kilohertz bandwidth. Technically it can be a little smaller than that. CW transmissions are about 150 hertz, much smaller bandwidth. That allows multiple stations to be in the same amount of space that any of the others would take. That's one of the reasons CW is so popular. You can put all of your output power into a much smaller bandwidth that allows your signal to penetrate through poorer conditions much more easily. Now some of the digital modes, for example radio teletype or RTTY, its bandwidth is about 270 hertz, PSK 31 about 100 hertz. FT8, one of the most popular new digital modes, has a bandwidth of about 50 hertz. So again, you can fit a lot of stations operating those modes in the same bandwidth as some of the others. It's important to know kind of generally the bandwidths so that you can operate without interference to other stations. So the answer to this question is 150 hertz to 500 hertz. You figure if CW signal is about 150 hertz wide, then you should be at least 150 hertz away from somebody else operating CW. Next question. When selecting a single sideband transmitting frequency, what minimum separation should be used to minimize interference to stations on adjacent frequencies? The answer choices here are 5 hertz to 50 hertz, obviously too small. 150 hertz to 500 hertz, that's good for CW, but not single sideband. Next choice is 2 kilohertz to 3 kilohertz. And we'd like to think of single sideband as about a 3 kilohertz wide signal, so 2 to 3 kilohertz should give you enough separation from another station. If you figure whatever center frequency they're on, they're going to be, and if their bandwidth is 3 kilohertz, they're going to be about 1.5 kilohertz below that and 1.5 kilohertz above that center frequency. So 2 to 3 kilohertz away should give you enough space to not interfere with them. And the last choice is approximately 6 kilohertz. That would work for AM. It's not needed to have that much separation for single sideband. Next question. How can you avoid harmful interference on an apparently clear frequency before calling CQ on CW or phone? If you tune in, you don't hear anybody, you think it's open, you shouldn't start transmitting right away. Instead, if you're on CW, send QRL followed by your call sign. Or if you're on phone, ask if the frequency is in use followed by your call sign. Remember, you're always supposed to identify every transmission. So always, when you're transmitting, use your call sign. What QRL means is the frequency in use, and same thing on voice. I've had multiple occasions where I didn't hear anything. I send QRL followed by my call sign, and somebody answers and says it's in use. Yes. So then I can move off frequency to select a different frequency. Next question. Which of the following complies with commonly accepted amateur practice when choosing a frequency on which to initiate a call? The first choice is listen on the frequency for at least 2 minutes to be sure it's clear. That's generally might seem like a good practice. It's not maybe necessary all the time for 2 minutes. Sometimes that may not be enough time. The next option is identify your station by transmitting your call sign at least 3 times. If somebody's on there, that would be interference to them, so please don't do that. The next choice is follow the voluntary band plan. Now that's really the best option to follow. If you know where stations typically operating the way you want to operate are, then that's where you should be. So following the voluntary band plan is the correct answer. Now in this particular question, the last answer choice is all of these choices are correct. And even though A seems like it's pretty good, B would not be a good answer at all, so that would eliminate choice D from being correct. Next question. What is the voluntary band plan restriction for U.S. stations transmitting within the 48 contiguous states in the 50.1 MHz to 50.125 MHz band segment? So you look up the 6-meter band plan, and in that section, 50.1 to 50.125, it says DX window. So the answer would be only contacts with stations not within the 48 contiguous states. That's what DX means, long distance foreign contacts. Next question. Who may be the control operator of an amateur station transmitting in RACES to assist relief operations during a disaster? RACES is one of the 2 emergency communications organizations that amateur radio operators belong to, or could belong to. RACES stands for Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service, and it's actually created by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and those operators are volunteers that have to be certified by a civil defense agency, and then they communicate on amateur radio frequencies during drills and exercises, and during emergencies they train for that. The other emergency service that amateurs train for is ARES, A-R-E-S, which stands for the Amateur Radio Emergency Service. That's also volunteers, but it's not certified by another agency of the government. So when the question asks who may be the control operator of an amateur station transmitting in RACES to assist relief operations during a disaster, the answer is only a person holding an FCC-issued amateur operator license. Next question. Which of the following is good amateur practice for net management? Now a net is where you have a group of hams all kind of transmitting back and forth, but it needs to have a control operator kind of organize who's speaking and who's transmitting and who's receiving when. So a net will occupy a certain frequency for a certain amount of time. But again, remember the rule is nobody owns any of those frequencies. You don't have any more right to those frequencies than anybody else, even if you're a net. And you've used that frequency for ages in the past. It doesn't really matter. If somebody else is on that frequency, you don't have right to that frequency. So the answer to this question is, have a backup frequency in case of interference or poor conditions. Now the other choices are always use multiple sets of phonetics during check-in. No, everybody should train to use the one set of phonetics that should be the accepted ITU phonetic alphabet. However, people sometimes substitute other words for the phonetic alphabet, and you'll probably understand what they mean, but it's not a good idea. Another answer choice is transmit the full net roster at the beginning of every session. Most nets have the net control operator ask for check-ins during the net and not the whole roster right at the beginning. The last answer choice is all of these choices are correct, but we can see that 2 of those choices really aren't good. The only good choice is have a backup frequency in case of interference or poor conditions. So that's the right answer. The last question: how often may RACES, R-A-C-E-S, training drills and tests be routinely conducted without special authorization? And the answer is no more than 1 hour per week. That restriction has been imposed on RACES drills to ensure that there's not a huge burden placed on volunteers. Well, that wraps it up for this session. Hope you learned a lot, and we'll see you for the next one. 73, this is KE7CR.